Hello and welcome back. My name is Jacob. If you're just joining us, I recommend going back and checking out a few of the previous tutorials if you're coming back for another tutorial. Today we're going to talk about modifiers, and we're going to go over a few different tools before those modifiers, things that'll make your life easier when you're doing this modeling. Now, I know we've talked a lot about various random things, and today is another random thing. After today, I think we're going to try and get into some project-based learning, but I still feel like there's just so many tools to introduce that we need to take the time to sit down and go through one at a time these tools. So today what I'm going to look at is, first of all, some tools. You'll notice you have your toolbox over here. Well, you have two toolboxes. One is going to let me turn on my screencast keys that I always forget to turn on. But I'm going to hide the N toolbox, and the T toolbox I'm going to focus on a little bit. You'll notice if you select your object, right, that's right mouse on it, then if you come over and you tab into edit mode where you can see the vertices, when you're editing your object, this changes over here, your tools tab. The create tab pretty much stays the same. There's some extra things you can add in or not. If you're on a mesh, you can only add meshes in edit mode. If you're on object mode, you can add whatever you want. Some of the other stuff really just stays the same going between the two. But one of the big differences is tools. Now I want to show you a couple of these tools. The first one is bisect. We'll start over in these add ones. Let's see. So we know translate. Just going over these. We know what translate is. That's when we hit G and we can move it around. Rotate, we know what that is. Scale, we've done that with S to make it bigger, smaller. Shrink and fatten. It's kind of similar. I've never really used it, to be honest. Push and pull, haven't used that, to be honest. Now, the ones I want to look at are these add. To add in extra vertices. And the easiest ones are extrude, which we've done. You can actually extrude lines or points or faces. We've also, I think we've looked once at subdivide. If I click subdivide, I'll let you see what it does. But if I click it, it basically cuts the cube, cuts all the lines in half basically. All the faces it divides into four. So, at least all the square faces it divides into four. Let me be clear there. So that's subdivide, and I'm just going to Control Z to get out of that, to undo that. Excuse me. So I can do other things like, let's show you knife. If I want to use a knife, what I can do is it gives me a little knife with a green dot, and I can drag this dot along any of these lines, and then it lets me draw and drag out a line to another line. So anywhere I want to cut, I can cut. And if I click, and then I can do multiple cuts. And then when you're done, you can read along the bottom header here. It says you can hit return or spacebar, or you can hit escape to cancel. So I'm going to hit return, and notice I now have these extra vertices in here and extra lines. This face has been subdivided very custom because of that knife cut. It's like I literally took a knife and cut new lines in there, and it automatically adds the points where I put the points down. Very similarly, if I undo that, I can do bisect. Now bisect will cut not just a face, but it'll cut one plane through the entire object. Let me show you that. If I just drew one line coming through like that, it cut my entire object along that line. It literally bisected my object on that line that I drew. So that's another way to kind of subdivide or add extra faces and points. And the final one I want to show you is this loop, cut, and slide. Now this has a keyboard shortcut as well. It's Control R. And what we want to do here is you can click it or just press Control R, and it'll actually show you where to cut, and it'll cut it in a loop around the object. And you can see, since it's a square, it's going to be going around the whole cube here. and then it'll let you, once you pick the dimension, it'll let you slide it along the where you want it to click again. So let me show you that. If you click, so you have your object selected, you click loop, cut, and slide. Well, it wants to know, do you want it X, Y, or Z? And I'm going to make it what's perpendicular to the Z direction. And then I can slide it anywhere up and down along that. And then click, and it's good. And it'll actually cut perfectly parallel to the direction that I want. So that's another way to add a quick subdivision if you don't want to subdivide the whole mesh. Alright, with that said, those are just some interesting quick tools. We may use those later on in our project-based learning. The last thing I want to talk about today, and what I want to take up the bulk of the video, are what are called modifiers. Now modifiers, if we go to object mode and click on an object, which is our cube, modifiers can be found in the properties panel. If you go to the little wrench icon, it'll have, this is your modifiers tab, and you can see we have our cube selected. A modifier applies to a single object. So if I had two cubes, I would have to choose which one I wanted the modifier to apply to. And if I click on add modifier, you're immediately confronted with all kinds of modifiers. And there are some really complex ones, there are some really simple ones. Today I want to talk about the generate modifiers. That would be the second column. And let me just give you an idea of what they do. Generate modifiers will generate new meshes, or it will it generates extra lines, faces. Basically it adds on to your mesh. It makes more out of it, or it doubles it, that kind of thing. Deform modifiers will not necessarily delete or make extra vertices and faces, but they'll change how your mesh is shaped. And you can do that with all these tools. We won't really go over them. Some of them are a lot more complex. But for example, if I added armature, you could add like bones of a skeleton to a model, and you could position it as you would like a rag doll, essentially. So those are the ways to change the shape of your mesh, but not add or delete faces. Simulate will essentially let you run a small simulation where, and you need a lot of vertices for these because they can get highly detailed. But for example, if I wanted to run a cloth simulation, it would turn my object into cloth and let physics take care of it according to how you define the physics. So if I set like a gravity and let the cloth fall onto another plane and collide with it, then I could run a simulation and then stop it where I wanted and preserve the mesh from any point in that simulation. And there's a lot of simulations. They're pretty advanced. Actually, I've only seen or played with one in my experience, and I'm not very experienced at all, as a reminder. So maybe we'll get into these eventually, but it'll be very specialized, and like I said, I don't know much about them. So modify is the first column that we skipped. Modify is kind of like deform, but it changes not the mesh, but it changes other things about the mesh. These are data that you don't necessarily see when you're looking at the model itself. And I don't want to get too far into it. We'll talk about UV and what that means in another tutorial. But for today I want to talk about generate, and this is how we add on things to our mesh. And I'm going to start from the bottom and kind of work my way up. I might skip one or two that are a little more complicated, but I want to show you most of them. And the first one is going to be wireframe. So if we click on wireframe and add this modifier, you'll immediately see that our cube that we had selected in object mode changed into a wireframe. And there are a bunch of settings. Don't ever be too intimidated by the settings on a modifier. Usually they're just a few sliders and you can play with them and see. The nice thing about modifiers is they really aren't permanent. I don't have to undo this until I click apply, and I don't have to click apply for quite a long time. I can work with this in the meantime. So don't click apply. You can actually copy to make a new one if you want, but look at some of these sliders. So the first slider I want to look at is this thickness factor, and this is the main one. This is the main, I guess, parameter for your modifier here. And if we click and drag on it, or you can type a number, you can see that it gets thicker and thicker as I increase thickness. It makes sense. Very simple and straightforward. You can change the offset even to make it bigger or smaller. That's going to be set back to 0, which is the default. And then you have the crease weight. I really don't know what this does, so I'm just going to click and I'm going to drag it to kind of find out. And because I don't have this crease edges checked, it really does nothing. So you can see there's some special things you can do with it, but you don't necessarily have to. You can have even thickness, you can have uneven thickness, and just play with it, and that's the best way to learn. So Wireframe will do this to any shape, and if you don't believe me, I want to show you. I'm still in object mode, okay. So I'm going to delete the cube, and I'm going to add a more complex shape, which is the monkey. Now with the monkey, looks like I'm upside down or something. I am upside down, okay. So with the monkey, I'm just going to pull him up so you can see him a little better. If I add that same modifier, the wireframe, it will do the wireframe even for very complex meshes. It's a very cool modifier, and it can actually save you a lot of time. That's really the point of these modifiers, is to save you a ton of time. And that's my Steam. I should turn that off. The point of these modifiers is to really make your life easier. When you're modeling, these things are tedious things that can be run in scripts to make your life easier. Alright, so let's move on to the next modifier. And the next one is going to be triangulate. Now what triangulate does is it changes all of your faces into triangles. If you recall, I think it was our very first video, faces can be, typically you want faces to be either triangles or quadrangles or squares or rectangles. And now you can see on Suzanne here, on our monkey, we have mostly squares. There's some triangles like in his eyes, but if I wanted to turn them all into triangles, that would take a while. Or I could just come over and click triangulate. And what it'll do is, okay, so if I click apply, then it'll turn everything into a triangle. And you can always Control Z those applies, so to get rid of the modifier. So very simple modifier, very specialized. Now for the next one, called subdivision surface, I actually want to go back to my cube before I click on that. So I'm going to go to object mode, I'm going to delete this object, add a new cube with Shift A, and I want to actually move the cursor to the center. So the next thing I add, it goes to the center. Okay, so the cube, if we go to subdivision surface, that sounds a lot like subdivide mesh over here in edit mode. If I go to subdivide, notice this is what happens when you subdivide and when you keep subdividing. Okay? Now pay attention to the difference when I add the subdivision surface modifier. Notice the inside shape is what it will turn into. And the subdivisions, you can actually increase the number for the view and increase the number for the render. So if I crank up the number in the view, you can see that it will actually turn my square into a circle. Subdivision surface will smooth out as it subdivides. If you come over to the tool panel on the left, subdivide will not. So use those wisely, and you can, I'll actually show you an example at the end here of something that's really good for. You can make harsh edges very soft and rounded with the subdivision surface. It's a very useful tool that you'll see a lot of use in. So I'm going to get rid of that modifier and move on to the next one, which is solidify. Solidify I'll show you with even a different mesh. I'm going to go to edit object mode. I'm going to delete this square, Shift A to add a plane. Now a plane is 0 thickness. Okay, and if I go to solidify, it'll add thickness to the plane. You can actually do this to the house that we made in the other tutorial, and the main parameter here is going to be this thickness slider, and you can see as I slide it, it'll make my plane as thick or as thin as I want it, and you can go negative to go higher or lower. And that's really all it does. If you have a complicated mesh, even, you know, just like our house, like I said, you can make it thick, and so the walls have some thickness to it. Very simple. That was solidify. Skin. Skin is a very interesting one, and I need a different setup to show this to you. So I'm going to do a trick here. I need to be in edit mode, but I need to make my own points. So I'm going to add whatever mesh I want, just a plane is fine. But in edit mode, I'm going to delete all vertices. So now I don't have anything to work with. I'm going to make my own. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to draw, kind of like in the first video, a series of points. And I'm going to make it, I don't know, just like a spiral for fun, I guess. And then I'm going to, with all of this selected, going to add the skin modifier. And what it does is it adds faces around where your points were. So it builds it up so you can just draw a quick sketch and then turn that into a mesh without having to worry about making faces out of everything. And then you can change some smoothing options, that kind of stuff. But your next step would probably be to add a subdivision surface modifier to make it nice and round, and there we have a nice little coil. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of subdivision surface, I'm going to get rid of the skin modifier, and I'm going to go back to object mode and delete this object. Now I'm going to add a new cube, and let's look at our next modifier. I'm going to skip screw. Screw is used to set up a very special geometry, and I'm going to skip remesh and multi-resolution. These are all used to modify. Multi-resolution will let you work with different resolutions, so like high detail on one thing and low detail on another thing. The next one I want to look at is actually mirror. And mirror, let's say that I had a centered mesh here. So if I delete this and I snap my cursor to the center and then re-add a cube, it's important to have things centered when you use the mirror modifier, because what it does is, let's say I wanted to turn this cube into a person. Well, the first thing I would do is go to face select, and I would start extruding. And I would, well, let's scale the whole thing down so we can see it well. And I would maybe extrude up, and turning on this mirror modifier would allow me to make sure whatever I do, I'm going to go to the y-axis because that's the one I'm working on right now. It'll let me mirror whatever I'm working on. So let's say I want it to be perfectly symmetric. So I want to extrude down, and I want to turn this into maybe an arm with a bunch of little extrudes. And whatever I do, it's going to be mirrored. This is used a lot to preserve symmetry, so you don't have to worry about getting the exact same thing on the other side. And like I said, you can actually do it on whichever axis you choose. You can set the merge limit so that when the points are close enough together, you can merge them. And then when you're all done, you can click apply, which actually you can only apply these in object mode. So you go back to object mode, you click apply, and then you tab in, and voila, you have all of your mesh done. Okay, so that's what mirror does. Mirror is extremely useful when you have things that are just simply symmetric objects. Alright, the next one, as I get a new mesh to play with and destroy, next one is going to be mask. We're going to skip that. Mask lets you hide certain parts of the mesh. Edge split, I guess we can look at edge split. Oh, edge split didn't work with my cube before. Edge split will let you, actually I don't remember what edge split did, so I'm going to skip it. Decimate is the next one then. And decimate, what it does is lets you reduce the resolution, and it's kind of specialized here again. So let's pretend that I had a lot of detail on this cube. So I'm going to say subdivide a lot, and be careful when you do this. This is going to greatly affect the system that you're working on, the resources of the system you're working on. This will quickly use up a lot of RAM, so don't go too small. But let's say I have a lot of detail on this cube. Let's say, for example, I just use a circle select and pull out some of these, and I extrude them and pull them up. You know, so it's pretty good detail on this cube. But it's a little too much detail, so I want to scale it back. So I can come down to decimate, and decimate will have this ratio slider. And you can choose either collapse, unsubdivide, or planar. Collapse has this ratio slider that you can pull and change to essentially make the mesh simpler. So if I tab into object mode, I'm going to change this down to a ratio of about 30%. I'm going to click apply, and then when I go back into my object, it's messy, but there are a lot less faces. And that's just one way to, that's just because how the algorithm works. But that's one way to add some chaos, I guess, to your mesh, and also at the same time reduce the number of faces that you have. So again, it's kind of specialized, but that's what it does. Okay, now get a new cube to play with. And the next one is build. I'm going to skip build. Build's used for making a quick animation of, think of it like if you've ever used like PowerPoint or a some kind of similar presentation software where it'll have an animation that kind of shows everything coming in. Well, build does that for an animation. It makes an animation of building your mesh out of faces. The faces will kind of just pop in, and it's used with animations to do that. Boolean is the next one. Boolean requires two objects. Notice when we click it, it lets us add a second object. I want to add a different object here, something that will give us some variety. I'm going to do a, let's see, a UV sphere. And I'm going to grab it, and I'm going to move it so it has some overlap with my cube. Okay? Now, click back on the cube where I have this modifier, and I want to click on the object sphere. Now, it's going to change and select only the part that intersects with the sphere. And you can see that here. It's kind of hard to see. But I can change the intersect to union so that it kind of combines, and not the inside part, but it combines all of it on the outside at least. Or I can change it to difference, and that will basically cut into my mesh this hole where it is, where the sphere is clipping through. So to give you an idea, I'm going to click apply. I'm going to see if I can remember how to do this. I'm just going to grab this, move it out, and let you see. And so Boolean, what it did is it subtracted all of that from this cube. Very easy way to combine geometries. Now this is an extremely powerful tool, but again, it's kind of a specialized use. I could do that to each face if I wanted to. So that's Boolean. Again, it requires the two objects. And the next one is Bevel. Now Bevel adds a nice bevel to your sharp edges. And what a bevel is kind of just a smoothing out of corners. So we can actually change the width of the bevel and make it bigger or smaller. We can change the number of segments for a finer detail. And then we can change the profile to see if it goes in or out. 0.5 is the standard smooth edge, but if you go less, you can actually have it come inward, as you can see, and make an interesting corner. Okay, so that's Bevel. It's used to change the edges. And the last one is Array. Array is a very simple one. And what Array does is it basically makes multiple copies of your object. You can see mine are kind of stuck together, so I'm going to change the offset so that they're spaced apart a little bit, easier to see. And actually I'm just going to offset it in one direction. And I can make as many as I want off into the distance here. Let's say I make 5. Well done. And then I can come up and add another array, and this one will offset to the side. So there, now I have 10, and I can easily make that in multiples of 5, and now I have a ton of the same object. And that is what Array does, is it basically makes copies of the same object. And the things I changed here are the offset in the X direction, the Y direction, or the Z direction. If your object is over 1 Blender unit long, you'll probably have to change this because it will overlap. And the default offset is just 1. There are some other options here, but that's the simple, straightforward look at Array and what Array does. So that is a look at a bunch of different modifiers. Now you can end the video here if you feel like you know what everything does. I'm going to go ahead and just use some to make a quick bowl and show you what can be done. So first, let's set the scene. Well, let's get a big, nice UV sphere. And again, I'm actually going to have to delete it because my cursor gets away from me and I want to get it right in the center. So I'm going to add a UV sphere. I'm going to scale it, make it nice and big so that we can see. And what I'm going to do here is tab into edit mode. I'm going to hit 7 to go to a nice up view. I'm going to hit C to do a circle select, and I'm going to scroll to get basically this whole top half selected, and I'm going to select not quite the whole top half, but that's good. And I'm just going to delete all these faces. So this is going to be my bowl. Okay. And the next thing I'm going to do is come here and I'm going to add a solidify modifier to it. And the solidify modifier is going to let me add that thickness to my bowl. And then the next thing I'm going to do is add another modifier, and I'm going to add subdivision surface. Now I really don't need to subdivide this a lot, but if I go about 3, you can see that the object now has a nice round lip. on that cup. Okay. And if I wanted to, I can go back to object mode and see kind of what it looks like, and I can apply these if I want to. You don't have to apply those right away. And then I go back and I can see, let's go to rendered view. Oh, I got rid of my light source, sorry. That's not going to show up right. So that'll give you an idea of what it looks like. So that's a nice easy way to make a bowl, and all we did is delete the top of a circle and add 2 modifiers. And so just want to show you the power of modifiers. That was the point of this video. As we move into a project-based learning after today, we're going to be using a lot of modifiers, so I don't want them to be unfamiliar to you. So if you have questions, post them under the video, but go ahead and play with a few of those. Just make shapes and play with modifiers, play with their settings. And the other last thing I wanted just to tell you is if you have questions, there's actually a whole like tutorial wiki documentation on the Blender website. I actually have it pulled up here. This is on the Blender website. You can see wiki.blender.org. Now this is the 2.6 manual, but most of this applies, actually almost all of it applies to the current version of Blender. And I can go down and look at all of these different modifiers. I'm on the modifier page. I can read about how they work, and if I wanted to, I can click anything. Let's say subdivision surface. Or what was the one I didn't remember what it did? Edge split. No. Remesh. Remesh can fix heavily triangulated meshes. So you set a threshold, and if you have way too many triangles, it'll turn them into quadrangles as much as it can based on your threshold. Sounds like what it does. If I wanted more options or more specific ideas, you can click on it and you can see. Oh yeah, looks like what it's doing. So there's 3 different remesh modes. You can change all these triangles into faces to going that way. So it's a really good wiki. I encourage you guys, if you have questions, to check it out. Again, it's wiki.blender.org. And I would go with the 2.6 manual. That's the more recent of them. But if you have further questions, go ahead and post them in the video. And otherwise, I will see you again next time.